breathe right now. No matter what you are doing as you listen to this sermon, just stop. Pause for a brief moment and breathe. Let's be honest. It may be the first moment that many of us have really stopped to check in on our breath this entire week. So for the next little bit, for the duration of this sermon, if you do nothing else, I want you to just breathe. Breathe in and out. Don't think about how challenging things are right now. Don't focus on all the different things you could worry about and that certainly deserve your attention. Don't look at your phone. Don't even look at the screen as I talk if you don't want to. Look out the window onto God's creation. Of all the things that you could do in this moment and for the next few moments when we're together, I want you to, above all else, breathe. Breathe in the breath and presence of God. Breathe out the worry that our current crisis has brought us all. Breathe in the love of God. Breathe out your stress over the health and financial struggles that are constantly bombarding us. Breathe in the grace of God. Breathe out the fear that comes with the fact that we are all walking in darkness, unsure of what the future will bring, and we are reaching out, desperately searching for something stable to cling to. Breathe in the peace of Christ, and breathe out anything that would stand in the way of your peace. We need to train ourselves to stop and breathe, because we are heading down into the depths right now. I wish I could say that we were already as deep as we're going to get, but we don't know how long this crisis will last or how bad it may get if we don't do our part to distance ourselves from one another for a time so that the most vulnerable among us can remain healthy. We are hopeful with the relief package passed in Congress this week, but we don't know if it will be enough to get us through all the way to the end. Will it continue to get worse before it gets better? Will what we've been doing be enough? Or will it get darker before we finally see the dawning of a new day? We may not be as deep as we are going to get, but there is no doubt that many of us feel like we are heading down into the depths right now. And I don't know how you feel when you are sinking deeper and deeper into a truly difficult life experience, but for me, it feels like it's hard to breathe, like I might suffocate. It feels like my chest tightens, my shoulders and neck tense up. If I am not focusing on it, I may realize that the stress and worry that I am holding on to have made it so that I haven't breathed deeply for a long time. I have to stop and pay attention to my breath. I have to make myself relax and breathe. When my wife Lelia and I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, there was a time when we were on a bit of an exercise kick. We'd run with our dog Murphy. He's a large Weimaraner and an energetic dog at the time, and he needed exercise anyway to keep him calm. We had a regular routine of getting up early and either running with Murphy, or most days of the week we'd actually head to the Y, right next to the church where I worked. We'd get up in the morning before the rest of the day prevented us from doing it, and we'd get out there and do what we needed to do. And then one day, Lelia suggested that we try yoga. Now, I'm not afraid to tell you that I was skeptical at first, and a better word might be cynical. I'd never tried yoga before. Was that something that men were allowed to even do? If I was going to get in a workout, shouldn't I be lifting weights, playing sports, running, something that would really push me and make me sweat? Isn't yoga just basically stretching? But I wanted to be a supportive husband, a team player, and I've got a history of back problems, and I had heard that yoga was good for that. So I told her I'd give it a shot. We signed up for a class. We made sure we had the right mats and towels. Lydia told me that this was a hot yoga class, so I was likely going to sweat, so we brought water bottles. And she was right about the heat. One class had just ended when we walked into the room, and the feeling when we stepped into the room was oppressive. The temperature was still high. It reeked of sweaty bodies, frankly worse than any locker room I'd ever been in. And I'm a pretty hot-natured person anyway, so immediately I began to feel the perspiration beating up on my forehead. I don't have to imagine how foolish I looked during this entire experience because there was a floor-to-ceiling mirror on the wall right in front of me, so I know exactly how foolish I looked. It was harder than I could have imagined. I was pushed in ways that I had never even contemplated. And I'm not ashamed to admit that there were multiple times when the rest of the class was in the middle of holding some pose whose name I will never be able to pronounce, and I just couldn't take it. I had to stop and take a water break. And Lilia just looked at me and smiled with a look that said, "I told you." I'm sure it happens all the time. Some guy comes in thinking he can take on yoga, and suddenly he realizes he's got his work cut out for him. It's going to stretch him in ways for which he is completely unprepared. By the end of the experience, I was breathing heavily. I had sweat through everything I had on. My towel was soaked and needed to be wrung out. I could already tell that when I woke up the next morning, I was going to be sore in places that I didn't even know existed on my body. But mercifully, right as the session was about to finish, the instructor took us through a series of poses that moved us toward the floor, and eventually she told us to just lie flat on our backs, to put our arms down by our side, and to close our eyes. The music up to that point had been surprisingly upbeat for what I expected out of a yoga class. It was more motivation than it was mindfulness, but that moment it was soft and relaxing. And then she came by each one of us and placed a cool towel on our foreheads, and I just breathed. And I realized that I had been holding in so much, that I had been getting on with my daily routine and all the stresses that came with it, and I had not, in a long time, stopped to breathe. The psalmist seems to have a clear sense of what it's like to be constrained by the pressures of life, to the point that you're almost suffocating. The only way you know how to deal with it is to scream. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord," he says. He recognizes the nature of his situation. It is so bad, he is in so deep, that the only thing he can think to do is yell and cry out to God for help, for mercy, and for release. It's a cathartic experience, really, just screaming. We call it letting out some steam for a good reason. We hold the tension of all of our experiences in us like a pressure cooker. With the right amount of heat, these experiences change us. They make us stronger. They build us up into resilient people. But if the heat rises too far and if the pressure builds up and is not released, like a pressure cooker, we can feel like we are going to explode. We need to let it out. And the psalmist cries out to God. It could be a cry for help, a cry of anger, a cry of frustration or fear. But even the act of just letting it out is helpful, because some of the steam has been released. But it's been released in a way that is productive. He's given his frustrations over to someone who can do something about them. And after he has cried out, he waits eagerly for God's response. Scholars have said that this was likely a pilgrimage psalm. It was likely sung by weary travelers on their way up the hill on which the holy city of Jerusalem sat, as they'd be making their way to the city for pilgrimages for the great festivals like Passover. We might be able to imagine a young Jesus, his parents, his brothers and sisters, and all of their traveling companions singing it on that trip to Jerusalem before he stayed behind to teach and discuss the nature of God and God's kingdom in the temple, and his parents were forced to search high and low until they found him again. It is a psalm to be sung as a worship song, as one returns to the physical location at the heart of the faith. It is a psalm to sing as you are returning to the one place you can think of to go, to cry out for help and relief when everything else has failed you. This is a psalm to be sung when you realize that you are so tense, so concerned, so stressed and wound up that it feels like you are a piece of rope or a rubber band that is being pulled at both ends with such force that you are certain that at any moment you will simply pop or split apart. And that might be an appropriate way to describe how many of us feel right now. We're struggling so hard to figure it out, to find answers, to make it all work, to deal with the isolation and the fear. We feel like we could snap at any moment. Or it might be that we're so overcome with worry because so much is still unknown that we feel like we're just sitting in the darkness at night, just waiting for the sun to rise so that we can at last see again. There's a moment like this in the movie Shawshank Redemption, where the character Red Redding, played by Morgan Freeman, is sitting in his cell as the guards call for lights out, and you hear them throw each switch, and the scene gets darker and darker until it goes dark on the cell of his friend Andy Dufresne, played by Tim Robbins. Dufresne is serving a sentence after being wrongly convicted of a murder he could not commit. He had found a way to acclimate himself to the oppressive prison life, to make allies and be useful to others so that he could survive. But after a series of conflicts and betrayal, when he realizes he will never get out, it seems like he's going to break. And Red's just worried for his friend. He honestly thinks that Andy is likely about to reach his point of no return, and he's afraid that he'll take his own life. But he feels helpless. There's nothing he can do about it. All he can do is sit in his dark cell and worry and wait for the sun to rise. Now, Red also serves as the narrator in the story. And as you watch him holding his head, running his hands through his hair, you hear him say over the scene, "I've had some long nights in stir. Alone in the darkness with nothing but your thoughts, time can draw out like a blade." We know that place. We know those moments. We have been in that kind of darkness where it feels like we have nothing but our thoughts and time is drawing out like a blade. And it may feel like we're in one of those moments right now. The psalmist describes a similar experience, as if he is in the midst of some great dark night of the soul. And he says he waits as those who wait for the morning. And he echoes that phrase again to help us understand its sense of urgency, as those who wait for the morning. He has cried out, and now he needs some response. He needs to know that God has heard him. So he keeps peering into the darkness, searching and waiting. It invokes the image of a sentinel, a soldier standing watch on top of a great castle wall, staring off in the distance during war times, knowing that someone or something is out there and coming toward him. The problem is that he can't see in the darkness. So he stands completely alert for fear of attack. And only when the sun rises and he can see out into the distance again will he feel relief. That's how the psalmist waits for God. He waits for eagerness, even more eagerness than a soldier standing watch at night. He knows he will not be able to rest until God has answered him. And all he can do is cry out to God and wait for a response. But as desperate as he may be, he doesn't wait in fear. He waits with confidence and hope, because the psalmist has walked with God long enough to know that God always hears him and God will always respond in some way. And that response will be filled with love and care and guidance and a presence that will enable him to endure. The good news in this psalm, and that we find throughout scriptures, is that as far down into the depths as the psalmist feels at this point, he knows he can cry out to God and he will receive an answer. And even in the darkness and the silence, he knows that God isn't that far off. He's been in this relationship long enough to know that God is out there somewhere. He knows the nature of the God to whom he cries. It's a loving God who forgives instead of holding a grudge. It's a God who takes our stresses, our worries, our fears, our troubles, and if we're willing to give them up, he replaces them with faith and peace. This God is powerful and uses the power for the redemption of the people. And so the psalmist cries out as honest a cry as he can muster, and he waits and watches for God to work as only God can. Let's be honest, though. Sometimes the waiting is the hardest part. We get the part of crying out to God. Some of us are so frustrated and angry and afraid, filled to the brim with stress, that crying out may come easy right now. It's the waiting that's the challenge. But notice again that the psalmist doesn't simply sit and wait in some kind of passive posture. He's active while he waits. He's keeping the faith. He's keeping watch, waiting for the first sign that God is moving toward him, so that in the first instant he sees it, he can move toward God. When it all seems too much for us to bear, we need to remember that God hears our cries. God is constantly moving toward us. We have to keep watch and keep the faith. We have to keep believing that God works in the chaos, and we can't sit idly by. We must work in it as well. This is a moment for us to lean into the best of our faith in the midst of the darkness, so that even the smallest light can come out in new and creative ways. Again, we are heading into the depths of this global pandemic. And I'm not yet convinced that we're at the bottom of the pit just yet. As we sit in this proverbial darkness of this crisis, the goal is to do whatever is necessary, no matter how difficult, to make it through the night to the dawn. We must remain faithful and know that when we cry out, God hears us. We have to remember that we can only control what we can control, and we must act, or in a time of physical and social distancing, we must refuse to act in ways we normally would so that we can work for the good of everyone around us. We must keep watch and keep focus on the only unwavering source of truth and hope that we see clearly in Christ. We must determine what is going to take to keep us steady in this time, and we must be resolved to do it. We must stay healthy in every way, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and we must manage our anxieties. We have to eat as well as we can. We have to get up and move, even if only walking around the house and up and down a flight of stairs. We have to get fresh air, even if it only means opening a window and sitting on the porch. We have to find something to be grateful for every day. If ever there was a time to count your blessings and remember the good things, it is now. Keep a list. Share them on social media if you're into that. Find joy in every day. Create a faith display in your house. All spaces where we feel the presence of God are sacred. But if you need to find your watching place on the wall where you wait with more eagerness than those who wait for the morning, then carve out a spot in your house. Make sure that everyone knows it is the place where you go for reflection, prayer, and meditation, and just to pause and breathe in the presence of God. And if you are in that watching place, maybe they can just give you some time and wait patiently as well. Also, remember that you are not the only one crying out and waiting. So is everyone else around you. And just like you are waiting for God to speak and act, so is everyone else. But also remember that God does some of God's best work when working through people. So even as you wait, keep the faith by acting with love and kindness to your neighbors. Leave flowers on their doorstep and text them once you're a safe distance away, just to let them know there's a surprise waiting for them. Take a piece of sidewalk chalk with you the next time you're out on a walk, and simply leave notes and pictures of love and happiness and hope on the driveways you pass. Take a cue from those isolated in high rises in Italy who sit out on their balconies at night and lift their voices united in song. Or maybe those in Midtown Atlanta who ring bells and bang drums and blow air horns and clap and shout as loud as they can to say thank you to everyone in the medical profession on the front lines fighting this thing for us. One of the best suggestions I've seen and heard of yet is creating a faith display somewhere on your house that isn't just for you, but is there for your neighbors to see. And know that even as you wait and cry out, you are still keeping the faith. My favorite idea so far is to take a prominent window in your house that everyone can see from the street. Take painter's tape or masking tape, and right in the center, make the outline of a cross. And then tape off sections coming off of the cross that look like they could be rays of sunlight. And then tape off different patterns at different angles. And then if you have washable paint like you would use with your children, take as many different colors as you have, dilute it just a bit and mix in a little bit of dish soap so that it'll be able to come off the window later, and fill in each section so that when you step back, you have your very own stained glass window. And as the light comes into your house where you are physically isolated, you might be reminded of God's love even as you wait. But at night, when the lights are on in your house and it feels like it's darkest, the light will shine back out through the window so that everyone who passes by your house and takes in this beautiful sign of hope can remember that God is still working in the darkness. We are in the darkness of this ordeal, and it may get darker still. We wait for the morning, but we have complete faith that the morning will come. One of my favorite hymns, like many people of the Christian faith, was first published in 1876. Its words were penned by Horatio Spafford after his experiences of great trauma and loss. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 not only ruined him financially, but it also claimed the life of his 4-year-old son. Spafford was hit again financially, an economic downturn in 1873, and he planned to travel to Europe with his family. But in a late change of plans, he sent his family ahead of him. And while crossing the Atlantic, the ship that was carrying them sank after colliding with another vessel, claiming the life of his 4 daughters. But somehow it spared his wife's life. And she sent him a telegram that simply said, "Saved, alone." Originally, Spafford named the hymn tune Ville de Havre after the ship carrying his family. And he wrote these words: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well. It is well with my soul." From the depths we cry out to God, and we wait with more eagerness than those who stand watch and wait for the morning. But as we wait, we continue to actively pursue our faith, and we breathe, knowing that God has heard our cries and is always faithful. So no matter what, no matter how long, no matter how dark, no matter how deep, it is still well with my soul. Amen.